I am so excited to be interviewing Ashley Milne-Tyte today. For those of you who read Hired Gun, who read anything in the blogosphere, Ashley's work is out there talking about very provocative issues about women in leadership, talent development, and much, much more. So welcome, Ashley. It's great to have you here.
Thanks very much.
So Ashley, there's so much interesting information in your bio about where you came from, how you started off, what you're doing now at Columbia. Could you just give everybody a snippet of what it is that you want them to know about you before we get into the interview?
I'm a journalist. My background's in public radio. I worked for the public radio business show Marketplace for about 7 years. And so I did a lot of business stories, but that's where I got really interested in the topic of women in the workplace. I did my first several feature stories about that related to women's relationship with money or women in work in some way when I was there. And then when I went freelance in 2010, I was still pursuing those stories, and in 2011, CUNY, the City University of New York, has an entrepreneurial journalism program. And I studied there for 1 semester, and on that program, everybody had to kind of give birth to their own media business. And since I loved audio, I knew I was going to do something. I knew I was going to do a podcast. And I knew it was going to be something to do with women because of all the stories I'd done about women. I hadn't honed it down to women in work initially, but after a couple of weeks, with the help of my professors, we were all told we should go really niche. And I decided that since my stories on women in work and women in money had got a pretty good reception, and I had found them fascinating to do and learned a lot doing them, that is the topic I would choose for my podcast, which I call The Broad Experience. So I've been doing that for about a year, and that has led to some other things like the Hired Guns blog. I also have a monthly column in Metro, the commuter newspaper, about women in career stuff. And I'm also doing some public radio stories as well on this topic, largely because I want people to associate me with this type of coverage. And I'm hoping if I'm on the air again with a few million people listening, then that may drive a few people to the podcast as well. Oh, and I teach radio storytelling skills at Columbia Journalism School during the month of August.
So you talk on your bio page a lot about ethnicity. And I'm just curious, what are the differences that British women face in the workforce versus American women facing in the workforce?
I think most women have problems with confidence. And I think, you know, when Brits move to America, we notice how confident and shiny everyone seems. But a lot of that is on the surface, and underneath, people may not be half as confident as they seem. I would still argue that there is a bit more of a confidence issue in Britain, because the whole culture is about, you know, not speaking up too much, not being vulgar, not putting yourself forward, or at least it used to be. Now, I do think that's changing quite a bit, but certainly the way I was brought up was that you don't advocate for yourself because your work speaks for yourself, and that's not the polite thing to do, and it's not what you need to do. You know, all these things which I now tell women at any opportunity not to listen to. You've got to advocate for yourself, especially in this country, because it's so competitive, and if you're not advocating for yourself, you just cannot guarantee that anyone else is. So I do think there are some cultural differences still between Britain and the US when it comes to just behavior, and that's men and women. So as I say, I do think confidence perhaps is still at a lower ebb on the whole in Britain. I can't prove that, you know, I don't know that I have statistics to prove that, but I'm just going to tell you I think it's true just from my, you know, what I know of my friends over there. I try and talk about ethnicity, you know, whenever I can on the show, on The Broad Experience, because I think often when we talk about women, we just say women do this, women do that, and of course we're all individuals, everyone is different. A lot of women dislike even being put in a basket with other women when you talk about these confidence issues, because they may not have them, or maybe they conquered the world when they were 25 and they've just been doing it ever since, and they hate sort of what they consider gender stereotyping. I have tried to have as many non-white guests as I can on my show, because I think when white women will experience all sorts of interesting things and implicit bias in the workplace. You know, most of us will. But if you are not white, you're experiencing a whole other layer of reaction on top of that, just because of the implicit biases we all have in us and the way we think that person is and where they're from and the sorts of things they do. And I don't think you hear about that often in the general women in career space, right? I mean, for instance, Lean In, which I did a whole show that it was a debate with 6 different women on Lean In and with, different races of women. And, one woman pointed out that there is barely a non-white person mentioned in that book. And in fact, I believe both of them may have been men. I may be getting that wrong. One of them was certainly a guy. But she really noted that as somebody who is not white, that she felt that her experience wasn't really represented in that book. So I really try and talk to as many different types of women as I can, just to get that other point of view across so that we're all aware of it. Because I also think it's fascinating to learn what other women are going through that perhaps you are not, if you're more of what I call society's default setting. And for now, anyway, in 30 years, white women are not going to be society's default setting. So I think it's really interesting to look at some of these cultural, and ethnic differences and stories. This is interesting because if you had told me 5 years ago that I would be doing a show about this whole arena and writing about it, I would have been askance, because I really never thought about this stuff at all when I first started in radio. And I should say that I did a whole bunch of things in my 20s that had nothing to do with journalism. I switched careers when I was about 30 to go into the journalism sphere because I'd sort of fallen in love with radio apart from anything else. And my dad had worked for the BBC for his whole career, so I kind of came from this radio household. But I thought radio was incredibly boring as a child. TV was where it was at. My brother and I wished he worked in TV because radio was so dull. But then I moved to this country and I realized you really couldn't get good news about the rest of the world anywhere other than public radio. So that's what led me to become very interested in that medium. But I think it's not. So my whole realization about this, and another reason I'm doing the show isn't just because I did these stories, but it's about it's because of things that I experienced in the workplace. And many of them were at a certain job that I had in radio. And it wasn't so much at all being conscious of bias or men being treated differently. It was realizing how the men behaved and how I wasn't behaving. It was realizing how people advocated for themselves or didn't advocate for themselves in my case, because I felt that my work should speak for itself, and it was vulgar and unseemly to have to talk myself up. All sorts of little things like that. So it wasn't so much noticing that any man I worked with got different treatment. And in fact, I worked in a very female-heavy office, and our head office was actually on a different coast. So you weren't even interacting physically with your bosses every day. It was more of a phone relationship. But I did learn a lot of things about myself when I was there, and a lot of it, I have to admit, was in hindsight. It was afterwards I looked back on a whole series of events and I thought, wow, he did that, you didn't. He got the job, you didn't. It was that kind of thing that really got my brain ticking about this stuff, and combined with me doing these stories about women and work that made me realize just how differently men and women still behave in the workplace, how we react to various situations at work, the comfort level we feel with speaking up in meetings, putting ourselves forward, all those sorts of things, all of which I was very uncomfortable with, and I didn't see that as detrimental to me, really. It never occurred to me. I was brought up with zero career awareness. Mm-hmm. Nobody taught me about career development. I mean, I wish I'd known all this stuff when I was 23. Unfortunately, it took me till I was nearly 40 to work it out. But, I mean, you live and learn. What can you do? It was, to answer your question again, it was more about me noticing the way other people behaved in contrast to the way I behaved, and then I saw that actually worked for them. I'd made a lot of mistakes that I didn't realize were mistakes until quite a while afterwards.
Can you share some of those mistakes with us?
Well, yeah, I mean, the one thing, the really obvious one, is just not advocating for yourself. Thinking, well, it's obvious that I want that job because I'm doing it. And that's the main one that always springs to mind, is being very uncomfortable with saying, with articulating to the higher-ups that I really wanted the job. And now they knew perfectly well that I wanted it, but I wish I had been more, I hate, the word proactive is so overused, but I do wish I had been more active in speaking up and actually not assuming that it was implicit, the extent to which I really wanted that role. I also think, you don't know what would have happened. You can't look back and say, well, if I'd done that, this would have happened. It's not, you just don't know. But when I think back to perhaps claiming a project, I think at one point somebody had said, oh, why don't you, offer to do X project? And I just thought, oh, I don't know if I can do that, and I don't want to rock the boat because I'm just really enjoying what I'm doing. This whole thing of saying no to things because you're a bit scared of what may happen if you say yes. That's something that came up with one of my interviewees really early on in the podcast, this woman called Joanna Barsh, who worked at McKinsey for a really long time and, was part of a lot of the research, one of the authors on a lot of that great research that McKinsey's done on women in the workplace. And she said for years she did this thing of saying no to opportunities because it seemed risky to her. Even though she was in a pretty senior position, she said no to opening an office here or an office there. And she said, I just didn't realize for years that I had to say yes first and then work it out. And again, I did on a much smaller scale. I would say I did similar things, feeling, ooh, I'm not sure I can do that. I'm going to say no because I'm just happy, doing what I'm doing, and this seems to be working out for me. So I'm just going to stick where I am. Very sort of risk averse in that way. Mm-hmm. And again, looking back, I wish I'd had the gumption to say, okay, and then worry about it afterwards while I was doing it, rather than think, ooh, no, that's too scary, I can't do that. Here's this woman who's very prominent, who was able to put this into a pretty short tome, right? I think it was under 200 pages or thereabouts, and it's selling. And I have heard, in some reports that more women are asking for raises, and they're sort of citing Sheryl Sandberg as a reason. That was on a BuzzFeed editor wrote about that within a few weeks of the book coming out. I know some men. I'm trying to remember who I spoke to recently, but certainly somebody, one of the higher ups at his firm, a man, had read it and was encouraging other male managers to read it. I don't know the extent to which that's going on, but of course, I think it's very helpful just for guys to be able to see how things can come across from the woman's point of view, Mm-hmm. And just the fact that this topic is so out there now because of her. I think that's brilliant. Part of the reason I started my show was because I, like Sheryl Sandberg, believe that women sabotage ourselves to a great degree. I've talked about that. I've certainly done it without realizing that's what I was doing. And yes, I realize that there are all these institutional issues as well. But I think if we could work on both of those, then that's brilliant. And I think she does a good job with examples of bringing that issue to the forefront of many women's minds who won't have thought about it before at all. Like me, they're just going along in their rut, the way they always do things. They don't realize they're doing anything that could potentially be harmful to them at work. So I think it's fantastic that just the fact that this stuff is so much more out there than it was.
I know a lot about Gen Y. You know a lot about the whole issue of women in the workforce. Well, tell me what you know in terms of what is Gen Y expecting in the workforce right now, and the women of the Gen Y, and how are they changing the workforce just based on those expectations?
So from what I can work out, they expect a lot more from it than Gen X did. They want the career that they want, and we've all read the stories that a lot of Gen Y aren't necessarily fantastic with authority. They want to be the authority. I'm sure that there's so much sort of generalizing done on these topics. So, but it's almost too early to tell in a way. I think I know a lot of Gen Y want to be their own bosses. Mm-hmm. so part of me, when I came away from that interview, for instance, part of me thought, wow, they really are going to change the world. But then, I bet you a lot of Gen X thought the same thing. And unfortunately, these stubborn workplace situations have a tendency to keep perpetuating themselves. So I don't want to be pessimistic, but I think the jury's out as far as what Gen Y are going to achieve when, the rest of the workplace is still ruled by baby boomers or Gen Xers with particular ways of thinking about, and including about gender. So I don't know. Who knows? We don't know because it hasn't happened yet. And I work with, when I was on this CUNY entrepreneurial journalism course last year, I was I think I was the oldest person there. I was the only, one of very few Gen Xers. Everyone else, there were about 11 people, and they were all in their sort of mid to late 20s, which was a bit intimidating. But it was also really interesting to sort of see their energy, realize how incredibly digital they are. I feel that I learned a lot from being around 11, 27-year-olds for 4 or 5 months. And they're super people as well. Well, they were on that course. They're really, really type A personalities, a lot of them, which I have said on my podcast, I'm more of a B+ or an A- myself. So it was fascinating to be around them, but I don't know what's going to happen down the line because they've only been some of them have been in the workforce for longer than others, of course, but what happens is determined by outside forces as much as it is by them. So I think the jury's out. Could be fantastic. Maybe they will change the world. Yes, everything will change because of Gen Y women. Or maybe they will get hung up in some of the same ways that other people have. I interviewed, you probably know League. Do you know League?
Mm-hmm.
So they're, this powerful startup partially funded by Sheryl Sandberg that supports, their mission is to get Gen Y women to the top. And I interviewed one of their co-founders for my 6th show just about a year ago. And it was really interesting to listen to her and her passion and her enthusiasm and determination that, yes, my generation of women is going to conquer these barriers that previous generations have not been able to, partly because a lot of us had working mothers, no-nonsense working mothers who made it happen, partly because of what we're doing at League. We're changing the way companies think about us, and we're helping companies see ways in which they can essentially make it easier for women to work there, but they're trying to open companies' eyes to the ways in which women and men operate differently and bring their attention to even the way they phrase job applications. That was one thing I found very interesting about what League is doing. She said, we're working with companies to make their job applications more female-friendly and to use vocabulary that won't turn women off. And a lot of vocabulary on job descriptions, certain job descriptions, a woman will just think, I'm not interested in that, ultra competitive environment. That was one of the examples she used. I thought that was fascinating.
You said something very interesting that I actually wrote about in the blog when Sheryl Sandberg's Lean In book came out, and my saying was, what are women leaning into? It's great that women are doing all this, but what about the organizations? Because that's my line of work. What are the organizations doing to welcome women? How is organizational development helping to create a culture that is women-friendly, etc.? Any thoughts on that? I'm just curious because you said something very similar just then about, organizations, systems what are they doing? You get stuck in there. What are your thoughts about what organizations can do to help women lean in more to an organization other than changing job applications, that kind of thing?
That's so tricky, and it's partly tricky for me because I now haven't worked in an organization for a few years, so I'm kind of, and to be perfectly honest, the ones I have worked in have been very, I want to choose my words carefully here. Put it this way, they haven't been the types of organizations that have special programs or anything that really helps employees, at least not that I was ever aware of. So when I hear about friends who work in these big companies and they roll out the red carpet, at least in theory, I'm really surprised because I never worked for one of those companies. So, I know a little bit, what they can do. I think it's great if there are people, what you really need at the end of the day is people at the top who care. who really care about this. And it's all very well having somebody, I suppose, with the word diversity in their title, but if they're sort of, you know, slotted into a side room and they don't really have the support of the top people at the organization, then that's really not going to go anywhere, is it? I mean, I think everyone who I know has talked about this has said that what makes a difference is having the very top people on board with really understanding what is going on with women, why women are falling out of the pipeline, and those sorts of things. I mean, I'm working on a public radio story right now about female lawyers and what women at the top firms are trying to do, sometimes surreptitiously, to change the status quo when it comes to the sort of tiny number of female partners, relatively tiny, unchanging number of female equity partners, and the fact that there's a big gap in compensation between men and women. And one person said to me, you know, we have a wonderful male partner at our firm he's just genuinely dedicated to this, and there's a woman colleague of mine who works not officially part-time, but she sort of doesn't work full-time, because she has some very young children, but she wants to pursue her career, and he wants her on board. So he's kind of giving her this leash and leeway to manage her life as she sees fit, and that doesn't mean she has to be in at 8 and leave at 10 every night. She can work more on her own terms, and this lawyer said to me, you know, that's working because he is genuinely interested in ensuring that the number of females in positions of power goes up at this firm. And you need that, I think. I don't think it works any other way. If you don't have the buy-in from the people at the very top, then how is somebody with a diversity job, you know, the word diversity in their title, going to be able to change anything on their own?
I want to make clear, I mean, there are men out there who are supporting this work, who want to see more women, who understand that it makes business sense to have more women at the top and on the board and that kind of thing. What can we do ourselves as leaders in this field, or just women in general, executive women, do to help support these men, to help educate them to understand why it's important to at least have this conversation, if not actually implement change?
I don't know. This is really tricky because I think, I mean, just producing a show that's sort of about women, I know that just the fact that you're doing something about women means that the vast majority of men will just write it right off. They're just not interested. And that, I find that a battle, you know, it's something that I'm exasperated by. And it's unfortunate, I think, that this has happened over the years, that men just immediately think, oh yeah, women, yeah, they're doing their thing over there. I don't need to think about that because, yeah, that thing, they're doing it. Networking thing, it's all going on somewhere over there. I mean, you have to communicate, don't you? And you have to hope that you get on with the guys who are in these positions of power as people and hang out with them and stuff. I mean, that's where you know, the networking thing comes in. That women, you know, studies seem to show that we network considerably less than men. We mainly because, you know, many women will have families they need to get back to after work. They don't take the time out to hang out with colleagues after work because they're just too busy. But all the evidence shows that you need to spend that time, that it's really part of your job to be doing that. And that's something else I would say that it took me a while to realize. Not that I had a lot of opportunity to network in such a small office, but it's something I'm very aware of now. You've got to put in that time outside of what you do to make connections, just to make relationships happen, you know, and keep relationships kind of bubbling away. So I think, you know, women need to do that. I mean, again, having not worked in a company for a while, I don't have this pat answer I can give, I'm afraid, but you have to communicate with each other. Otherwise, again, women are in their silo, men are in their silo, no one's communicating, and I think that happens far too often. And from the people I speak to, not just in law firms but in other places, a friend of mine works for a large global media company, and she says they have all these programs and efforts for women. She said, but still, at all our events, the vast majority of people standing up are white men to speak. Mm-hmm. And she said, I think the men think oh yes, there's this networking thing the women are doing. It's all great. Yeah, they're taken care of. And she said they're almost scared of us in a way. They don't want to sort of interfere, and political correctness rears its head, and nobody wants to say the wrong thing. So there isn't a lot of communication between the two groups. And yeah, I did a show, I called it the Man Show, several shows ago, where it was just guys and me talking about this stuff. So they could say what one guy was talking about, what he thought was wrong, and how he didn't feel comfortable saying a lot of things in front of women in the workplace because he was afraid he'd come off as sounding like an asshole, frankly. Don't know if you'll have to bleep that out, but he was afraid of coming across the wrong way, so he kept his mouth shut. But that meant that he actually wasn't asking some really important questions that could have enlightened him a lot about what the women were thinking. So it's not easy.
What's your take on female competition? Is it real? And do you have any advice for someone who may be in the middle of it, how to sidestep it as they move up the ladder?
Yeah, I think this is a really big topic. I mean, it's funny, I don't know if you know this, but I did a show on this a few shows ago, and I called it the Mean Girls edition. And I felt very torn about giving any time to this topic because I think that it's a real cliche about women, that they don't like each other, that they're competitive, this awful phrase, cat fights. I hate all that, and I didn't want to contribute any more to the very stereotypical images that come across in the media about women, and I actually said that at the beginning of the show. But I began hearing from people. A listener wrote in once when I wrote a blog post about this, about female bosses, and how I felt female bosses were getting a bad rap with female reports. And she said, look, she just wrote in about this appalling experience she had. She worked in academia with female bosses who were not only competitive with each other, but competitive with her, even though she was quite a way beneath them. And she found it so upsetting. She ended up leaving. She ended up quitting her job and leaving the profession. Because she said there just weren't enough there weren't enough women around at the top. So the ones that there were extremely competitive with one another. And it definitely happens. It's really unfortunate, but it's true because it's so petty. It seems so petty, and we feel like it shouldn't be true, and women should be supporting each other. But the woman I interviewed for this show I did about this said, when women came into the workforce in large numbers in the 70s and 80s, yes, feminism was all about supporting each other and being a sisterhood, but the reality is we were entering a workplace that was made by and for men, and that wasn't taken into account. And so that meant often behaving like a man to get where you are. And just recently, actually, I've been hearing about some female journalists who I respect but who are older, and I've been hearing from people who've worked with them that they're actually not easy to work with because they had to spend their whole career going, this is my story, I'm going to get this, because they were competing with so many men, and they're used to kind of guarding themselves, and they don't want to let other people in, and they're not generous. They're not generous colleagues to other people. And of course, I haven't spoken to them myself, but the word I'm getting from their colleagues is they've spent so long fighting to get where they are and to do the work that they do that they don't want to share anything with anybody else, and they always want that top story, and they're very competitive, and it's not fun to work with them. I mean, when it comes to, it's such a tricky situation. I think it really depends on the situation. I think, the woman I interviewed said if it gets really bad, then you need to speak to that. You need to sit down and have an adult conversation with that person calmly, not emotionally, lay out what you think is going on, speak to it from your point of view, ask for their feedback. She said, I think when you confront bullies, there's often a bit of a deflation that happens. But, she was in a situation that and I'm sure many others have ended up leaving because she just couldn't stomach it anymore. She felt attacked, and it was just so unpleasant going to work that she ended up quitting. It's tricky, and I think it really depends on the individual situation. Some people are just very insecure, and sadly, I believe women are often more insecure than men, and that insecurity can make us behave in a very ungenerous way. I think that's a very long answer to your question, and it probably wasn't the most direct answer, but Ask me something else if you want me to add something.
No, it's an authentic answer, and it's a shame that this has to happen. And for
It really
women,
is.
and for women to be aware that it does happen, and not to be surprised that you're not only going to necessarily get support, but sometimes you might not get support from a male or a female in your organization, and how to prepare for that.